Okay, so thank you so very much, everyone, for being here. We know that a few of our committee members could not make it, but they are attending live stream. We have one person on the phone, and I know Ms. Bridgewater is keyed into us virtually. And so I wanted to say thank you for your service. We absolutely appreciate what you're bringing to the table. We will introduce ourselves just to make sure we're now face to face so that we all know who we are. And I'm going to start with Ms. Bridgewater, who is virtual. If she can go ahead and unmute and introduce herself, please.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle Bridgewater, and I'm the District Improvement Director and of the Administrators Association.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Talia, if you'll go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
Yes, good evening, everyone. My name is Talia Morrell. And I know children in the district.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dorian Silva. I have a child who is Delaware Community School, who's moving to the new school with dual language, and I have a daughter at Acton.
Dan Cash, I have a child at Myers, one entering Myers and one at Montessori.
Bill Lemon, I have a daughter that just finished at Eagle Point and going into Hackett.
Good evening, Laura McKenna, Assistant Superintendent for Secondary Instruction. I'm Laura Franz, MLP Coordinator for the district and the President of the Teachers Union.
And I'm Rita Adams, Superintendent, and Mr. Lesko, who's our Director of Communications and Operations, and Mr. Baker, who is our Assistant Superintendent of Assessment, Accountability, and Technology. And so I just want to say thank you again for everyone to be here. So a couple of things just to get everyone kind of up to speed with where we come from and where we are now. The purpose of this committee is really to look overall with our district, thinking about equity, thinking about the opportunities and access for our students, and looking at what type of feeder alignment for our middle schools could we create, because we have the 3 middle schools that are roughly 650 seats each. And so we wanted to make sure that we were able to do that. I know that you have the information and we've gone through this before, but when we look at, we always start with our vision, mission, and goals, and we want to make sure that we are aligning our practices with vision, mission, and goals. And so as we look to engage our families in this process, and we thank our parents for being a part of this, we're really looking at the overall picture. Some of the details as to how specific families may be impacted, we're not going to be able to answer that right now because we don't even have a criteria of what we're even looking at. And so the purpose is to start with what's the overarching criteria, the overarching direction, so as we look at equity. And then we have to look at some of those granular details that may impact that decision that we're looking at making. So just to get everyone up to speed, we started back, we had a grade configuration phase 1 committee back in 2015. And that was when the decision was made by the board that all 6th graders would belong in the middle school. And middle school should be a minimum of 3 years, and we're looking at grades 6 through 8. And this is in order to support the continuity of instruction at the middle school level. We also know that in March of 2015, Brighter Choice had to close, and that created an influx of middle school students. So we had to deal with that right away. And that's when we used O'Neill Middle School, which at the time was West Hill. And so we changed that to a middle school. And then we started looking at how we could best serve our students. And so over the past year, we looked at what are the things that we need to do with regard to that 3rd middle school for 650 seats for 3 larger middle schools. And that's when we looked at the property of North Albany Academy and looked at changing that to a middle school. We are in the process of doing renovation at that school, and we are making that a 3rd middle school to house possibly 650 students. And so with that, we have changed O'Neill to the AIC program, which is the Albany International Center, and the dual language program. And those programs are being housed at O'Neill School of Excellence. And so now, as we move forward, we know that COVID posed some challenges, but one of the things that we were able to do through COVID was accomplish our sixth graders being at the middle school level. And so that's one of the goals that we've had as a district, to make sure that all of our sixth graders are housed at the middle school. So we've been able to do that moving forward. And so all of our sixth graders will be at North Albany Middle School, Hackett Middle School, or Myers Middle School. So that's kind of the abbreviated version to get you where we are today. At our meeting on July 7th, the committee members did request some of the following data: guidance for criteria that can be used to create enrollment patterns, current district middle school enrollment data, and then district academic outcomes. And so we did email this information out. And so you have the information that looks at the criteria that we can use with regard to how we align student enrollment in our feeder patterns. You can keep going. And so the other piece that we did share with you, we shared with you the enrollment data, and I think we have another copy of that today, which looks like this. And then we have the academic data that we shared out, which looks like this. And then you can see each of the schools and the achievement based on the New York State math and ELA exams. You can see where the students are scoring. So at this time, I think Mr. Lesko is available to talk about some of the key points to consider. Let me go right. Yes. The key points to consider. Did you want to?
Yeah.
You want me to answer for you?
So what, several key points to consider as you begin this process and work through this process. One is going to be geography, where the schools are, where the elementary schools are located in relation to the three middle schools that will be feeding the schools into. And this is sort of a complementary piece to the map that you have that has the middle schools and the elementary schools plotted on it, and it shows you the distance on city streets between the schools. It is quicker in some cases to take the highway, but longer to take the highway to get from certain schools to certain schools. This is if you drove through the city. That's as the streets are laid out, as the crow flies, as they say. You see we have the three magnet schools noted there, but that is the distance. So two things to think about as it relates to geography for our students, and they both relate to transportation. It seems if students live closest to their school, they're going to have more access to things like after-school programs, after-school activities. Their parents and guardians will have more access to school. It'll be easier for them to get there and engage in their students' academic process. But a higher percentage of students will not be eligible for transportation in those cases. We are bound by the state regulation for city school districts of 1.5 miles. So if you live inside of 1.5 miles, you are not eligible for transportation. And just an example is the corridor between Arbor Hill Elementary School and North Albany Middle School. For example, the students who live in the Yarborough apartment complex, that's about 1.1 miles from North Albany Middle School. So those students would not be eligible for transportation. They would walk down that corridor, which is a fairly straight shot on North Furl Street through a commercial industrial neighborhood that in the winter is, most of those businesses don't have sidewalks, et cetera. So those are considerations for students who are walking. If those students went to a school that was located further away, a much higher percentage would be eligible for transportation, but they may not have access to some of the after-school programs and activities, extracurricular programs that they would be able to participate if they're nearer to school, and their families might not have the same access to school if it's further away, again, to be part of those evening activities. So sort of two things to consider as you're moving through that part of the process. A few other notes: the dual language program, which is moving this year, to the former O'Neill Middle School at 50 North Clark Street. There's a separate standalone program that we're expanding. We already know that that program will feed into Hackett Middle School because of the advanced Spanish program that exists as a complementary middle school piece at Hackett Middle School. So that will eventually be a 2D program. It's currently going to be a 1D program for several years still as we grow. But those students will matriculate to Hackett Middle School. Delaware, where the dual language program is moving from, would also be considered a separate 2D school. Magnet schools, we're considering homeschools in alignment with the three previous enrollment committees' consideration of that. That was in the 2008-2009 school year when our former Philip Livingston Magnet Academy was closing due to low enrollment. We had a committee get together to look at figure that, and that we've had some adjustments since, but largely defines the way that Hackett and Myers are enrolled currently. And Albany International Center students, which will be co-located at 50 North Clark in the former O'Neill Middle School building this year, and also expanding to serve elementary grades. Those students will transition to middle school in alignment with their home school, and they are prepared to transfer out of that program and back to their.
Did you go here until you finish your? Okay. So just to clarify, so there's no need to plan for all your medical center. They don't need to be on this list of where will those students go, because they're sort of going to get absorbed into a bunch of different schools around it. Correct. They're not.
Correct. And you'll see there, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but you'll see their academic reflected in the academic for the other schools.
So they won't even ever show up as their own program.
No.
Their scores will go into
their home school.
Where our home schools for Delaware, their scores are, we see that they have for Delaware, those scores will be included there.
Okay, if we're just jumping in, can we go back? So, I mean, magnet schools or home schools, I think generally the neighborhood schools are pretty decent proxies for where people live, that if you go to your neighborhood school, you live near your neighborhood school. The magnet schools don't represent that at all. They pull people from all over the city. So while it's easy to say, hey, everyone who, lives near school, who goes near school, elementary A, if we decide that people who go to elementary A, it's easy for them to go to middle school A, well, they're all going to be similarly situated. You can't say that about the magnet schools. That I live 0.3 miles, 0.2, I printed out a map, 0.3 miles from Myers, and I live over 4 miles from Montessori. I'm sure there are people who live near Montessori, and that I just think that cohorting neighborhood schools makes sense when discussing where those people go. They're similarly situated. They all live near the neighborhood school. I think the magnet schools need to be broken apart into where do these people live, that it should be, there should be some taking into account of that. So, if I go to Eagle Point, I go to Eagle Point because it's convenient to my house. And if we decide that Hackett is the most, convenient place for Eagle Point, we're all going to be in that position. You can't make that, kind of declaration about people who go to Montessori. Can we break apart the magnet schools and not consider them schools?
So you're bringing up the point, again, points to consider. These are things that we would talk about. You're making a suggestion that magnet school students would be assigned to middle school based on their home location?
And I guess I'm guessing the summary of the quick reason why other committees came to the opposite decision was kids want to be with their friends. The class, the graduates month, they want to go to middle school together and be with them.
Well, and I think the great addition to that is from your capacity study, I think you can assign the students anywhere you want. You have about 20% capacity this year extra, and you're going to have about 40% extra capacity in the middle schools. You can absorb any amount of movement you want. That if someone wants to go, you want to assign Montessori to Hackett, and I say, oh, I want them to go to Myers. I just opened up a slot in Hackett and someone's going to want it. That with that amount of excess capacity, you could assign anything you want and you could still allow students to have the kind of experience.
Any other thoughts?
Do we have anybody from one of these magnet schools available?
I'm sorry.
Anybody from magnet schools?
Yeah, I go to most.
Oh, you do, okay, so you're fine with wherever, they're splitting up the school in friends?
I think they don't need to be split up. I think parents just need to be given an option. I bought a house 2 blocks away from my middle school.
Right.
If I want to disadvantage my kids and take them out of their cohort because I think walking to school instead of riding the bus 40 minutes each way
Yeah.
is just fine, I think I should be able to do that. And I don't think the friend group, I just don't think we should be deciding school decisions and family decisions based on like 5th graders hanging out.
The 2008, 2009 committee spent a lot of time looking at that, a lot of time looking at that question. There was robust conversation on both sides of that. Ultimately, they said a lot better than we have now.
Although 10 years ago, according to your projections, enrollment was rising significantly. You didn't have the kind of capacity you have now. So it's very different than 12 years ago right now, that your enrollment's falling, your enrollment's projected to fall for 10 years. There's the capacity to do that. I think that means we get to have our cake and eat it too. Assign students where you want and allow for choice. You have enough capacity to
So
absorb.
we also have to, I mean, so understood, absolutely, this is what we're here to do. We're here to talk about it. And no decisions are being made today because what the purpose of this committee is going to do is to look at recommendations to submit to the board. And so I think that is absolutely one, I'm writing it down, that's absolutely one consideration. That's why we have it under key points to consider. It is one of the key points to consider. And I think it's well worth it to, just explain, here's where we are. This is some of the considerations that we need to talk about. Because again, at the end of the day, one of the things that this committee talked about at the first meeting was being able to take information back to the community, to their homeschool, to talk with the homeschool and see, to get input from, more stakeholders as well. We're here to establish what, to talk out what some of these considerations can be. And I guess I'm not going to be the one to say yes or no. We need to talk about what those considerations are, and then we'll hear from more of our community, because it is a thought that could happen. We're just stating, as Mr. Lesko said, that the previous committee, and you're right, the circumstances are different. So the previous committee had some robust conversations about that, which is fine, but also our circumstances are different now. And there may be a different mindset at this particular point. Any other thoughts?
Not just to give you a sense of how this issue has played out for us over the last 10 or 15 years. In 0809, our enrollment was declining. We closed Livingston, which normally had around 900 students. It had fewer than 300 at that point because charter schools were growing. And then a bunch of charter middle schools closed. And our refugee and immigrant population grew tremendously. Then the Trump administration came along and that population started to dwindle. So it's, we are constantly in this process in the city school district Albany trying to project our growth long term when there's factors that we are so difficult to predict long term. So we went, we were through the first decade of the century going down in enrollment, through the second decade of the century going up in enrollment, and here we are finding ourselves on a downward curve again. So it's always a challenge.
I think one of the things to remember with regard to the demographics report, when it was shared at the board meeting, it was quite clear, one of the comments that was made from the presenter, the difference between projecting and forecasting. And so the projections are made on the data, which we are looking at a decline in enrollment. However, even in forecasting on our side of the house, there are things that don't factor into projections that may be happening in our community that impact how we forecast with regard to our student enrollment. And so those are things that this committee will have to think about as we look at what that criteria is for our feeder alignment. Any other thoughts?
I would like to add that when it comes to a magnet school, it encompasses the whole city. That's one thing to go to the location closest to you. I can understand that. But for My area, I live in the Eagle Point area, and I'm the farthest west part of Eagle Point towards the very end of Washington Ave Extension. And I just don't feel that, I think I'd rather have my daughter stay with her Eagle Point friends. Peer groups do matter, I think. And I just don't see the point of splitting up there. But when it encompasses the whole city, I can understand Montessori being split up. I have no problem about that.
And not even Montessori specifically, I
Oh,
just
right.
think anyone in the city.
You're
if they
saying, so
decide
what
they
I
wanna
wrote
go
down
somewhere
was
else,
that
and it
magnet
is-
schools based on homeschool. That's what I wrote. So we would be looking at not just one school, we would be looking at, so again, that criteria, should that be moved forward, would encompass all of the magnet schools, because if I'm hearing you correctly, that's what you're saying. It's
I
not.
think it could encompass any school, that I just think there's enough capacity that the idea, I just think cohorts make sense as an initial starting point. And then you have 20% capacity, students can really move around. So if any parent anywhere wants to move their student, it just doesn't seem like you have any constraints stopping them other than saying, we don't want to let you. That it just doesn't seem like there's any reason to keep any student in any particular school with the amount of capacity though.
Well, and so instructionally, when we talk about programming and we look at that and we talk about continuity programming, as much as we are looking at trying to make things consistent across all the middle schools, that transiency, if you will, within a building really impacts the continuity of instruction. So there is an academic impact with regard to if enrollment is changing, and this gets way down in the weeds that we're gonna have to pull back out of, because there would have to be some consideration with regard to if someone chooses to go to a school in the 6th grade and they're staying there for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, et cetera. Those are things down the line that we would have to look at, but initially we would have to examine what that impact might be academically if the population is going to be changing year over year. And we'll look at that when we start looking at some of that academic data as well.
And we've had a model somewhat like that from the time that Myers opened until the end of 2008, 2009 school year. Western Avenue United, Hackett, and Philip Livingston enrollment, and Myers was enrolled with a lottery. And we saw over that period of time, through the choice process, that the academic outcomes for students at Myers significantly outpaced. We developed an equitable system in our school district in which the academic performance of Livingston and Hackett fell off as families made that choice to go to that new middle school. So one of the things that is a goal of this committee is coming up with an equitable enrollment pattern in which all of our middle schools are enrolled equitably, and choice leads to an equity.
This is Leah, hear me?
Yes.
I have a few thoughts just on this, which doesn't necessarily negate anything that's being discussed, but one is I thought there already is a process to change schools if someone wants to. I think it's an enrollment that if I just randomly wanted my kid to go to Eagle Point instead of New Scotland, which is our home school, I can apply, and then based on space and availability, kids have gotten in to Eagle Point. So if that's still the case, then I think there would still be that option for someone to make that choice if their child was in Montessori, but they wanted to go to Myers and not stay with their home, or wanted to go to their neighborhood school, just apply for open enrollment the way historically you've been able to do. I just don't know.
But that's only if the middle schools have open
So I
enrollment.
had that thought, you can correct me if that doesn't exist anymore. Secondly, I do like the idea of, and I know this is just you're making notes and then decisions will be made later. I like the idea of keeping magnet schools like parent, a priority level.
Can she say that again, please?
You've got a little muffled, Leah. Not sure why. Did you change your position maybe? Not as well.
We kind of missed that last time.
We could take you about that earlier. Why don't You're still sounding kind of muffled. Nothing changed on your end?
My headphones, is this better?
Much better.
Much better.
Thank you.
Why don't you,
Is that
yes, much better. Why don't you make your second point again?
Yeah, so when I'm speaking, I'll take off my headphones, and when I'm listening, I'll keep them on. So I don't know how much you heard about my thoughts about just the fact that I think open enrollment already exists and families can apply,
Yes.
and that still exists?
Yeah.
Does it exist for middle school?
It's basic eligible basis.
Which, does that functionally exist?
Ms. McKenna?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
That does still exist?
Yes,
Yeah.
it does.
Oh, so then I was thinking if we wanted to consider something, perhaps we could consider that, you know, families who are in, sorry, now my dog's gonna bark. Families who are in a magnet school that maybe will feed into a middle school that's not their home school, they could apply for open enrollment and maybe give it some sort of extra weight and consideration for that. So if like the individual who's saying they want to potentially have their child go from Myers or from Montessori to Myers, they could apply for open enrollment and get a higher chance of it in comparison to maybe someone whose Myers is not their home school, either, if that's how it applies. So that was just my thought on maybe kind of meeting in the middle with this sort of discussion.
Okay,
Do we know that good suggestion? We'll look at how the open enrollment process would affect the decision-making process.
yeah, I'm ready, yeah. Okay, we ready to go to the next?
Yeah, the next slide is just,
Okay.
and so this is just a quick look at the current feeder patterns that we have in place. And these have been in, well, actually, they've been in place for no years. We're just starting for North Albany. This is brand new for North Albany this year as we transition away from O'Neill Middle School into the new middle school at North Albany. Delaware and the new language program, which we're in one building in our two locations, both feed into Hackett, along with Eagle Point, New Scotland, and Toast. The Myers feeder schools are Ash, Giffen, Montessori, Pine Hills, and as you can see, for this year, the North Albany Middle School feeder schools will be Orville, Cherry Brook, and Phillips Skyway Achievement Academy. And I think I heard this earlier in the conversation when I was playing the doorman, but for the first time this year, we will have all of our students in grades 6 through 8 in the middle schools, which has been a long-term goal for the school district, and we are very glad to achieve that at this point.
And what I'll do is I'll call your attention to the last 2 pages of the packet that we gave you. It looks like this on the front, but the last 2 pages show the achievement of the schools, and then, again, these would be O'Neill. This is O'Neill's information, because we do not have information right now because we are using the New York State assessment. And that may be something that we look at in terms of the criteria, because we've used the New York State assessment to prepare this information for you. However, we know that New York State assessment, because of COVID, you're unable to have that data, which is really reliable. And so there may be some other data points that we might be able to look at using in order to look at the achievement of predicting what our middle schools might be based on other achievement measures.
That's the end of my time on this.
Can you go back one real quick? Sorry. I saw 5 elementary schools going into Hackett, 4 going to Myers, 3 going into North Albany. What are the exact numbers?
You have that in your packet, and that was current as of, I think, July 22nd, and roughly 750 each at Hackett and Myers, and about 450.
Yeah.
440.
at Albany.
And so we're looking at, so one of the things that we're looking at in that equitable distribution is to make those numbers more consistent across the 3 middle schools. Just a reminder that demographic data cannot be used in order to determine feeder alignment. So we're not looking to balance based on ethnicity, because that's not a component that we can legally use in determining our middle schools. But we wanted to give you this information just so that you can see where the schools are and looking at the numbers and knowing that those numbers are really high. As we get closer to school, and usually by our accountability date, October, which we call our Beds Day, usually those numbers come down. We are absolutely under construction at North Albany. I know that we have 21 classrooms as our capacity moving forward. And at any given time while we're doing that, we have 21 classrooms available. Ms. McKenna, we're not going to get to 650 this year at North Albany.
No.
And so we're looking at, so that school will be a little smaller just by nature of the construction, but as different phases are open, we would definitely have more students that would attend North Albany. And so looking at the feeder pattern, we're looking at trying to have a presentation to the board later on this fall for implementation in the 22-23 school year. And it would be one of the things that we are suggesting with regard to that timeline is looking at using 6th grade as a cohort and a phase-in versus uprooting the 7th and 8th graders who've been in the school for 2 years or so. Typically, we want them to finish out, so it would be a phased-in model. And then with full implementation for the 24-25 school year. And then that means all students grades 6 and 7 for the upcoming school year will remain in place because the 8th graders will be going to high school in the 22-23 school year. Questions?
Will you be allowing for sibling preference?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Sibling preference, like my daughter's in 8th grade.
We are
walks with her
developing
6th
that
grader.
criteria. We're developing that criteria. So I'm not going to be able to say yay or nay right now, but we can definitely write that down as a consideration that as we move forward, part of the criteria would be looking at sibling preference.
Are Hackett and Myers pretty much roughly the same in classroom sizes or teacher to student ratios?
Ms. McKenna?
Yes, they are.
Yeah, okay.
They're 2 sections deep, so they have two team deep, they have 2 teams of 6, 2 teams of 7, 2 teams of 8, and they're got each team balanced.
Okay. And North Albany is about the same.
They're 1 deep, so they have one team
Okay.
of 6, 7, and 8, but as Superintendent Adams just stated, we'll grow that
Right, yeah,
as we implement the feeder line pattern.
okay.
And do we have a way to separate out, Delaware Community School, is sort of being divided, to separate out those test scores?
The scores for Delaware, separate them out
Separate the dual language those
from,
from the Delaware, they'll be now, even if there's been in 1 school, will now be in 2 schools, and I'm guessing there'll be some change in that.
so go ahead, Ms. McKenna.
So I just met with Dr. Wilson Turner today with
Yeah.
our dual language AIC principal. And we have a statistician that we work closely with, and he was able to disaggregate out the dual language data sets so we can look at that information.
Okay, so we can get that at some future, just sort of the update, how that update
Yeah.
is in some future meeting.
Because as it stands right now, the dual language program ties back to DCS.
Right, those scores are with our averaging.
Those scores are embedded in DCS, so we would need to aggregate those out. So for our discussion, one of the things that we need to look at is what do we believe the new feeder alignment should represent for our district and our community as we look at it through an equity lens. And we brought about all the different points. We talked about transportation, we talked about academics, we brought up sibling preference, we brought up, different components with regard to distance from the schools. Should it be the home schools? Should it be district-wide when it comes to the magnet schools? So we need to spend a little time ironing those things out. And then what do we want to achieve with the new feeder alignment pattern? Looking at our academic programming, looking at our enrollment of students. The enrollment piece is pretty simple. It's looking at 3 middle schools at 650 seats. That's pretty simple. When it comes to academic achievement, what are we looking like in terms of balancing that out? And then what additional information do the committees need? And this says August 4th, but that's today because this was from last week. So what additional information do we need for September 29th? And I do want to say, September 29th was the last one that we projected out. That doesn't mean that it's the end, because I had a little caveat there that said we can have more meetings as needed. I just wanted to get us through the summer because I knew that people would be planning during the summer for vacations and things like that. And so we have prepared a little packet for you to kind of look at where we are right now, just kind of thinking about, and I'm going to have you work in basically two groups, and district folks, I'm going to ask that you not be in the same group, and so that we can just have some conversation. And I will kind of walk you through this and then explain the way to look at it. So if you want to just rip your packet apart, that's fine, because that'll be the easier way. So what you have are the New York State assessments, and it's the ELA performance for North Albany, and then on the back of that, you have the math performance. And so randomly, schools have been grouped so that you could see scenario 1 would be 1 feeder alignment, scenario 2 would be another feeder alignment, scenario 3, another feeder alignment, and scenario 4 would be different. So looking at the achievement of basically the predicted proficiency, the district proficiency, and then where North Albany would fall is that gray line, you can see where that proficiency for ELA would be for North Albany. When you flip it over in that same scenario, here's what the proficiency, the predicted proficiency would be in mathematics. Now, that is the horizontal alignment of strictly North Albany. But when we start to think about what do we want all of our middle schools to look like, then we look at scenario 1 for North Albany, scenario 1 for Myers, and scenario 1 for Hackett. You look at it vertically so that you can see if scenario 1 is how we want our middle schools to look. That means that each of the middle schools are predicted to perform at roughly 19 to 25% proficiency. And if you flip it over, then you can look at scenario 1 in mathematics, and then you can see where each of the schools would fall with regard to mathematics proficiency. And if that's how we want all of our schools to look, then that would be what we would strive for. Okay? So want to have a little bit of conversation. I'm going to ask that you get into two groups and let's talk about what is it that, how is it that we want our schools to look? Because you can look at just the random scenarios based on this data, but there's also other data that we can definitely use, but we just decided for the sake of the conversation to start putting everybody on the same page with what do we want our middle schools to look like. When we do that, then we can start taking that overall picture and then working down to some of the details as to how do we get there. Okay?
What are the scenarios?
They're here. They're just generic. They're just generic. So we're doing a very high level approach. We're not looking at where schools go. We're looking at what is it that we want our schools to look like? What do we want them to look like? And so trying to determine where do we academically want to see our middle schools? And so they're just kind of random scenarios to look at. Because it's a very high level before we can get to actually what moves where. We need to come to a common ground with what is the expectation of how our schools look.
I'm sorry, I'm just not following. Like
Then I'll come over
scenario
and
one would give
I will
5
come over
steps,
and
so
I
it's
will work
across
with,
the
I will
whole
come over and we'll work on it, but I need you to work into two groups right now, and then you can start having that conversation, and I am coming right over to your group. Okay. So we'll take about 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll kind of see what we look like.
I probably have an extra one in my bag.
What's that? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, one mother.
So I'm sorry, it's just like, it's like the court attorney, that's overall outcome. Like, scenario one,
No, not at all.
highest average score. Scenario
Stay right here.
two, like, really helping North Albany, but it's really, really, yeah, and I'm just like figuring out what trade-off I want. I'm trying to work there. Period. I just don't-
What's that? I just thought they can.
we have to do a little, scenario.
I think with this with the realignment, what it does is it sets the three middle schools on the same playing field. Meaning it gives North Albany, Hackett, and Myers two teams of sixth grade, seventh grade, and eighth grade. So right now, for example, North Albany has 158 graders for next year on one team. Compared to a Hackett and a Myers, where they have about 110 per team. So now the class sizes at North Albany are higher for English, Math, Science, and Social Studies, and the class sizes at Hackett and Myers are lower. So when you think of it through an equity lens, right, and North Albany right now they have our most at-risk kiddos from a neighborhood perspective, and they actually need the smaller class sizes. And so I think what it does is it puts all three middle schools on an equal playing field with two teams at each grade level. And it does allow that flexibility that you're talking about to allow for more open enrollment should families choose to open enroll their child.
You know, this is the path that the school district in 2001, this community voted overwhelmingly to support a model that increases our students, serve all of our students, grade 6th grade, and our elementary schools. And that's how we spent 10 years, the first 10 years of the century, building, running buildings to do that model. Then charter schools happened almost simultaneously, but completely through for 150 years, all of them playing out well. Schools were opening, schools were closing, our road was growing, our road was falling. But this is the path that this community's been on for, again, more than 10 decades since the end of 20.
Yeah, there was never an intent, at least initially, to close Livingston either, like that came after the charter sort of exploded, that Myers was the third middle
It was
school,
always
right?
supposed to be
Yeah.
Hackett, Myers, and
Livingston still.
650 students.
Yeah.
I believe the 650 students is the ideal size for most of our, we can get all of our students, at the academic and level on services. That's the path that this community put us on as a school district. 20 years ago, we had the first $200 million referendum. All of our other schools. And that's what it's done. Now, I'm finally got the high school, which we're doing now. Now we're doing middle school facility, it gets back to.
And so we have about 2 minutes, and we've had some really good discussion. I guess what I'd like to know is, we've got some ideas about what we need as we start coming close to criteria and establishing what is it that this committee sees as being criteria. What we're gonna do is type all that up. We've heard all of them. We've heard all of the conversation, and we'll put it all together and we'll send it back out for people to review. And then what we need to do is look at any other data. Now I'm gonna go back to the point of with our academics. New York State assessment, this is about achievement. We haven't had this in the past year and a half. There's additional data that we could use that's more current, that really looks at the local students, which may change that academic balance of what we're looking at. Are we willing to take that into consideration and toss that into the mix as well? And then next time that we meet, we can start needling out what's the criteria in alignment with what we can do. Here are those pieces that we believe should be the criteria.
We had a conversation about assessment data in our group, and one of the things I wondered is what does it look like based on your feeder elementary school and your New York State Big Five regions outcomes? And, you know, because those are a little less objective around their grading, and less of a curve. But I wondered about that. We also talked about like some of the accelerated classes enrollment at the middle schools, like where they were coming from feeder schools, and looking at some of that.
Something more about that second one, or do you mean that?
Do you want to speak to that more, Lori? That was kind of where you were.
Yeah, I think I just mentioned, so each, at the middle level, we have an honors and an accelerated path. So as an 8th grader, you can take algebra and linear science, for example. And so when you look at that acceleration data across our 3 middle schools right now, overwhelmingly, the accelerated students are at Hackett and Myers. And so we wanted to look at, based on that acceleration data, where are those kids feeding from, for the, from the elementary feeder pattern? How do we then
Maybe distribute that.
balance that out?
That would be excellent data.
And we basically, you didn't say that we assessment, but you basically asking if we should consider an NWEA.
Yes.
Because we have more recent data, and my perception is more places to take them. There are
That is
adopting
correct.
out of those. Right. You're capturing. That's my impression. Well, that seems like good data. As opposed to mistaking that stuff.
Well, we certainly have, I think, more longitudinal data as well. We've been doing it for a certain bit.
Is there information available to read about research regarding feeder information?
Absolutely.
Regarding what's that?
Just making the schools more evened out. I'd like to just view that information. For browser.
We had talked about Superintendent Adams balancing of the socioeconomic status across the 3 middle schools, and then we talked about also that our 3 middle schools should be a reflection of our entire school district community. We talked a lot about balance and enrollment. Then
You want to talk about the scenarios?
oh yeah, and then I wrote this down, and we kind of talked a little bit about it, but I don't think I actually named it, is looking at our special education and our English language learner population, and how that impacts the feeder pattern as well. We do know, just because of the projections and the need, that we will have 6 self-contained special education classes in each one of our middle schools. So just, and co-teaching programs as well, but again, like North Albany doesn't have a co-taught program right now, but Hackett and Myers do.
Co-taught. So where you have 2 teachers in the classroom, 1 special education teacher, 1 content area teacher. And so they're co-taught, so the kids in the classroom have 2 teachers.
Yeah. And then we.
North Albany doesn't have any.
Other advanced classes.
Yes.
We also talked about each one of the scenarios, and when we reflected and kind of analyzed what the data was saying, we immediately threw out scenario 2 and 3 because we felt that there was a discrepancy, double digit, in the proficiency rate. We know that's only 1 data point that we're looking at, but we just felt that the discrepancy was too large of a gap between North Albany and the 2 other middle schools. And we really talked about, between scenario 1 and 3, and we don't know what schools are behind the data set, right, or the scenario. But we felt that scenario 4 was more of a reflection of our community.
It had the closest spread too, right?
Yeah.
For data, I know I had emailed with Gillespie and the superintendent, and I don't know if this data is available, but I can ask a little bit about special education breakdown for elementary school, and just, I don't know if that's available like at the level I'm looking for it per school, but I think my end goal, so any info that we have, the end goal is how realistically possible can we have equitable feeding into the middle schools for the percentage of special ed children having needs. So whether the data is available or not, just wanting to be able to look at that and, if you have 3 elementary schools who have a higher percentage of special ed needs in comparison to another set, are they all feeding into the same middle school? I don't know. I know what I hear anecdotally, but I don't want to base my opinions on the anecdotal. If there's any data, that would help.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And we've been trying for the last, I shouldn't say trying, we've been for the last 3 or 4 years aligning our elementary special education strands to where they feed into the middle school level, so there is that balance that you're talking about. But we can certainly get you that data to show, and there may need to be some adjustments at the elementary level to better align when we do this realignment of the feeder pattern.
And that's where the programming comes in that, you know, if we have our middle schools with 6 special education self-contained programs, looking at what has been asked for, where they are coming from, and then is it from an elementary school that may have, and I'll just pick a number out of the sky, one elementary school may have 5 self-contained programs, but another one only has 3 self-contained programs. Is there an impact of those students feeding into a particular list? And then what is their success rate at those elementary schools?
These percentages on the performance impact, is that passing the expected standard in New York State?
Say that one more time.
The percentages, so scenario 1 has 60% of district proficiency. Is that 60% of passing expected level of?
Yes, that would be levels 3 and 4. So let me make sure that I have, oh, go ahead.
Well, you need to be level 3 or 4 to move on to the next grade, essentially.
To be considered proficient on the New York State ELA or math.
Okay.
It doesn't impact moving on to the next.
What is just average? What is the 70%?
3.
3, okay.
So I want to go back and make sure that I have, and Ron, if I miss it, hopefully you got it, okay? So we have the feeder elementary school and NWA data. We're going to use the NWEA data. Looking, because that's more recent and it's also more longitudinal, we can see the patterns there. Looking at the accelerated classes and enrollment from feeder elementary schools into the middle school honors and accelerated pathways. Research articles for feeder alignment. Know that in other districts it may be called zoning and attendance zones. So if you see articles come to you with that, know that that's just a nuance in the language, but it's the same thing. Okay. Balancing of socioeconomic data, we will look at that. Looking at our special education, we have 6 self-contained programs at the middle schools, looking at our co-taught classes and where the special education students are feeding into, looking at the elementary level, how many special education programs are in that elementary school and feeding into a particular middle school. Did I get that right? And then looking at our ENL population and their success rate. Anything else?
Just how many kids are transportation eligible at each elementary school? I would guess Montessori is the most, biggest outlier for that. Everyone's transportation eligible. So, but I guess my kids went to Toast before Montessori, and I viewed that, most people got in the way I did, where they just said, I live within 7.75 of the school, that I view Toast as not particularly magnet. And it's you know, it's scores kind of. So, but just how many people go? Because I mean, if Eagle Point and Montessori are the ones where it's 95% transportation eligible, and there are other schools where it's like 15%, I just think that those things.
Because I know that we answered quite a few
I
questions
wrote down my list.
and I wanted to make sure that we did have your questions.
I mean, it's interesting. I think there's also value in when we can, keeping the same feeder pattern. Switching things around the least that we can, right? Because it's older siblings and parents have relationships with teachers and all that. Other things are arguably more important. In a few years, those relationships will be gone, forgotten. But in the short term, maintaining relationships.
And what if at the end of the day, the recommendation is to leave the feeder patterns the way they are? I don't know that. And that's what I don't want people to think that I'm coming in with some predisposed notion of this has to be done this particular way. That's the purpose of having the whole conversation and understanding all the different components, because, you know, what if that recommendation is, okay, we feel that this is the most equitable thing, and here we have 3 scenarios that we'd like to present to the board. And then the board then makes their decision based on, you know, which scenario best aligns. So, any other questions for this meeting? Okay, we'll get these questions answered. We'll also have a draft of points to consider. We'll leave it as points to consider until we make a firm recommendation of what criteria we settle in on. But we'll make a list of points to consider, and then we'll have this information that we will send out. And then we will come back here on the 29th of September. And we should have this out to you hopefully within, I would say, if you give us about a week to pull all of this together, we should have it to you hopefully by next week.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you all for a very productive, lively discussion. Love it. This is what it's about.
Just a weird question. I don't know if data-wise is possible, but I can see nerding out on like a database on it. Is there any way to create these scores based on like zip codes to see aligning more directly would actually do?
It's very nice work.
And I like your question. Is it for the 18th? And you're going to. So let's say.
I don't know if it's like online.
5 miles away, and once we're only there, and we get 1 mile away from visit, which means you drive by. I should know if we do that, but I'll definitely chance.
Okay. I mean, I think it'd be crazy to do with my city, I wouldn't say that representative, but it would be most informative for
I
the,
have to bring 1%.
hey, let's just open up enrollment
Yeah.
and everyone go where they want. And then you can kind of see the kind of school you'd likely be creating if everyone just went where the closest. So.
Good club.
Oh, I never went to dinner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think if 20% toast is more than a mile and a half away, I'd stop. Yeah, I mean, Toast has lower grades than all the other neighborhood schools except Sheridan and Giffen, and it's a magnet.
All right, so we were signing
Yeah.
off.
Excuse me?
Toast
Oh, okay, thank you.
meant so much attention to my children.
Did we stop live streaming?